Mysticism in Arabic and Islamic Philosophy. Brought to you by Audio.ai. By Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Mysticism in the Islamic context has traditionally been intertwined with the notion of Iqa, which is at once both wisdom and philosophy. Nasser, 1996. The source of mysticism and the mystical elements in Islam are to be traced to the Quran and the Islamic doctrine itself. Some of the Quranic verses have been viewed by the mystics and philosopher-mystics of Islam as allegorical and esoteric hints for those who can see them. God is the outward and the inward. Quran 57:3, He for whom wisdom is given, he truly has received abundant good. Quran 2:269, and the famous light verses. God is the light of the heavens and the earth. The likeness of his light is as a niche wherein is a lamp. The lamp is a glass. The glass as it were a glittering star kindled from a blessed tree, an olive that is neither of the east nor of the west, whose oil well night would shine, even if no fire touched it. Light upon lights. God guides to his light whom he will. And God strikes similitudes for man. And God has knowledge of everything. Quran 24:35. Can all be seen as containing esoteric insight. Throughout the ages, these verses have inspired a number of Muslim Gnostics, some of whom, such as Shihab al-Din Sarawarda, 12th, and Mullah Adra, 16th, have written commentaries upon them, e.g. Mullah Idris on the hermeneutics of the light verse of the Quran. From a mystical perspective, all later developments and interactions between Islamic philosophy and other intellectual traditions should therefore be seen as rational expressions of the mystical elements within an Islamic milieu. Mystical elements exist in Islam in two different and independent ways. Practically, Sufism represents the esoteric dimension of Islam in its purest form, while theoretically salient features of Islamic mysticism were gradually incorporated into the Islamic philosophical tradition. Islamic mysticism, therefore, stands on two pillars, first practical, then philosophical. That is, esoteric wisdom can either be attained through practical wisdom, which includes inner purification and asceticism, or through a type of philosophy which includes, but is not limited to, discursive reasoning. Mysticism in Arabic and Islamic Philosophy. Brought to you by Audio.ai. By Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. 1. Neoplatonism and Sufism. Following the early theological schools of thought in Islam, among which were the determinists, Qaterites, the eschatologists, Murjites and Wahdites, and the faith-based theologians, Asharites, there came the Islamic philosophical tradition and its many different schools of thought. Even though Al-Qaeda is regarded to be the first Muslim philosopher, the full impact of Hellenic thought on Islamic philosophy is best seen in the philosophical edifice of Abu Nasr Farabi, 10th. Al-Farabi, who is considered to be the father of logic in the Islamic philosophical tradition, is also the first to have embraced Neoplatonism, albeit in a limited sense. It was his paradigm that paved the way for mysticism to enter Islamic philosophy. Neoplatonism, which has remained one of the salient features of Islamic philosophy, has performed two functions, the intellectual and the practical, both of which have become an integral part of living a philosophical life. Philosophically, Neoplatonism provides answers to most major questions within the context of Islam, such as how multiplicity came from unity, and how corporality emanated from an incorporeal God, as well as explaining the ascending and descending order of beings. Mysticism in Al-Farabi manifests itself in two ways, philosophical and practical. Philosophically, as is evident in the letter concerning the intellect, Rizal Fil, Akala, his interpretation of the concept of the four intellects paved the road for his successor, Avicenna, Ibn Sano, 981-1037, who made full use of Neoplatonism. Al-Farabi tries in his writings not only to reconcile the opinions of Plato and Aristotle, with Plato seen as somewhat of a mystical figure, but also in his discussions of political philosophy, he replaced Plato's philosopher king with an imam whose understanding of truth is intuitive, who knows not only theoretical virtues, but also the practical ones. However, even though his musical compositions are sung among some Sufi orders in Turkey, and the Indo-Pakistani continent, and one can see the influence of Sufism in his bezels of wisdom. Funi al-Akam reports concerning him having been a practicing Sufi are quite nebulous. As to the master of the Peripatetics, Avicenna, Ibn Sina himself, the consensus of scholars is that Avicenna was a rationalist who embraced certain concepts from Plato, Aristotle, and Neoplatonism, and that the salient feature of his philosophical writings are discursive in nature. From here on, there are generally two distinct interpretations of Avicennan philosophy. Those who see him only as a rationalist, who had nothing to do with mysticism, and those who argue that later Avicenna had embraced mysticism, as is reflected in some of his later works. Most Western scholars of Avicenna, who see him only as a rationalist, similar to Alfaroba and Averroes, Gudas 2006, Adamson 2013, primarily rely on his discursive and rationalistic writings. Many Muslim philosophers, in particular Iranian scholars of Avicenna, have a more inclusive reading of his writings, and tend to agree that in the later period of his life, Avicenna developed an interest in mysticism. Nasser and Lehman 1996, Enadi 1996. For Avicenna, similar to many other Muslim philosophers, the ultimate philosophical endeavor was to unveil the mystery of creation, in particular, how divine unity became the multiplicity of the world of existence. To resolve this riddle, Avicenna adopts the Neoplatonic scheme of emanation, which has also been used not only by Sufis and Islamic Gnostics to explain the spiritual journey of man towards God, but also by almost all philosopher mystics from Sarawarta and Mulla Adra to Sabzawara and Abababia. Avicenna was not a practicing Sufi with any known affiliation to a Sufi order. In fact, Avicenna's meeting with the great Sufi master Abbasad Abul Khair d. 1049s, and the presence of an Oriental philosophy, al-Akmad al-Makrikiya, in his writing in all likelihood, are apocryphal. However, the presence of mystical elements in some of his later works is held by some to be undeniable. Aminuzavi 2003. For instance, in the 9th chapter of his philosophical masterpiece Remarks and Treatments, Al-Asharat wal Tanbahat, in a section entitled On the Stations of Knowers, Fo Maqamat al-Arifan, Avicenna appears to offer an explanation of the Sufi doctrine and openly to defend the Gnostic and Sufi method of attaining truth. While the authorship of some of his Persian writings are subject to debate, in some of his allegorical writings, such as Treatise on Ascendance, Mir Nama, Treatise on Birds, Risalat al-Nir, Salmon and Absol, Son of the Living Awake, Ibn Yakin, and Treatise on Love, Rizolafil, Ishq, not to mention his famous poem Ode of the Soul, Al-Qanaida Hal, Ain-Ya. The presence of Sufi and Gnostic elements are vividly apparent to those who follow this interpretation. With Avicenna, who represents the pinnacle of rationalistic philosophy in Persia, came two other intellectual trends. On the one side, there was the towering figure of Abba Wemid Gatsala, who rejected philosophy altogether and became the exponent of Sufism alone. On the other side, there arose Ismanala's philosophy, which incorporated Sufi and Hermetico-Pythagorean ideas within a philosophical context. Gatsala, an orthodox jurist and a major exponent of faith-based theology, Asherite, having studied philosophy, thought discursive reasoning stood on a solid ground, but soon turned against philosophy, offering a devastating critique of reason in his The Incoherence of Philosophers, Tahafut al-Philosopher. Having been disillusioned with intellectual sciences, he practiced asceticism for a number of years in seclusion, and finally found his answers in the Sufi tradition. The spiritual journey of Gatsala from an orthodox jurist to a Sufi is one of the most remarkable accounts of the transformation of a Muslim sage who turned from the outward to the inner life of Islam and found Sufism to be the only path that leads to truth. He spent the later part of his life teaching, writing, and practicing Sufism. Gatsala is one of the few mystics whose brand of Sufism embraces religious orthodoxy, a Gnostic intellectual framework, and the more practical and ascetic dimension of the spiritual path. Contrary to the antinomian Sufis, who violated the Islamic law, Sharia, and the more relaxed attitude of some of the other Sufis, Gatsala was an austere and ardent observer of Islamic law. He wrote extensively on mysticism, arguing it to be the only right path to truth. A notable piece among his writings on mysticism is The Niche of Light, Mishkat al-Anwar, a significant work of an illuminationist nature, and one that influenced the formation of the doctrine of illumination. Ishraq, by Sarawarta. Amin Razavi, 1996. Also, parts of his magnum opus, Revival of Religious Sciences, Yun al. Omal Dano, such as Book 35 of the Yun, the Book of Faith in Divine Unity and Trust in Divine Providence, are essentially devoted to an explication of the Sufi doctrine. He also has written numerous shorter commentaries on the spiritual significance of fasting, praying, invocation of divine names and attributes, and spiritual music as instruments of the catharsis of the soul. Mysticism in Arabic and Islamic Philosophy. Brought to you by Audio.ai. By Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. 2. The Ismaili tradition. Perhaps the most important figure of the Ismaili tradition, one who was both poet and philosopher, is Nuir Khosraw, 1004. c. 1072. Whether in his collection of mystical and didactic poems known as Divan, or his mystically oriental works such as the Sum of the Two Wisdoms, Jami al-Hikmatain and Knowledge and Liberation, Gushishwa wa Rohesh, he relentlessly offers advice on the catharsis of the soul and the pursuing of the spiritual journey. Nuir Khosraw's attempt to reconcile Sufism and reason is seen in his The Sum of the Two Wisdoms, where he argues that the sages of real religion, Yukamei Donai Ok, and the philosophers are in agreement. For Nuir Khosraw, the science of the soul is the way to attain real knowledge, knowledge which transcends the difference between the perceiver and perception. He writes, "Between the knower and the known, there lies a distinction by one who has awakened from sleep of heedlessness." Nuir Khosraw offers specific instructions how a novice should follow the spiritual path, relying on specific ascetic practices. Similar to the figures of St. Augustine and St. Francis of Assisi, Nuir Khosraw pursued a hedonistic lifestyle in the early part of his life, but underwent a spiritual metamorphosis and dedicated himself to the Sufi path. Echoes from both phases of his life can be seen throughout his works. Huntsberger, 2000. There are also several encyclopedic works of the Ismaili tradition, whose authors are unknown. Many of these deal with mystical and Sufi ideas. Among the works that have been influential in the spread of Gnostic ideas are treatises like Brethren of Purity, Ikhwan al-Wafa and the Mother of Books, Amal Kitab, Daftari, 1990, Nasser and Amin Razavi, 1999-2001. Mysticism in Arabic and Islamic Philosophy. Brought to you by Audio.ai. By Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. 3. The period of philosophical decline and the school of Shiraz. Traditionally, historians of philosophy have argued that after Ghazzala in the 11th centuries, philosophical activity in the Persian and eastern part of the Islamic world was eclipsed and shifted to Islamic Spain. There are those who attribute this to Ghazzala's scathing attack on the philosophers, but this is mostly a myth. The Islamic world at the time was so large, and the intellectual milieu so rich and diverse, that no single book could put an end to its philosophy and discursive reasoning. While it is true that peripatetic philosophy suffered a temporary eclipse in Persia, the reason lies in the socio-political realities of the Seljuk dynasty and the Islamic world's struggle with external forces like the Crusades. Recent scholarship, such as that by Qasim Kaki in the Journal of Andisha-i-Dini, has revealed that the so-called period of philosophical decline was actually a thriving era of intellectual activity in the southern part of Persia, where the so-called the School of Shiraz emerged. This school, whose salient feature was to synthesize rationalism, mysticism, intellectual intuition, and even popular Sufism, was undoubtedly the precursor to the school of Isfahan. Among the great masters of philosophical mysticism hailing from Spain, Ibn Mazara, 883–931, stands out. He was an ascetic whose views on the mystic quest for unity of the soul with God comprised a major theme in his philosophical mysticism. Others include Ibn Is, 994 to 1064, who emphasized mystical love, Ibn Bajjah, 1095 to 1138, who treated the concept of intellectual and mystical intuition as the faculty that experiences divine realities, Ibn al-Sid of Badajoz, 1052 to 1127, who developed what some have called mathematical mysticism, and Ibn Afail, c. 1105 to 1185, whose mystical allegory Son of the Living Awake, Ibn Yaqin, and his concept of active intellect, made him a major exponent of mysticism in the Islamic philosophical tradition. Finally, there is the Sufi philosopher Ibn Sabiyan, 1217 to 1268, who made an effort to bring about a rapprochement between philosophy and Sufism in a systematic treatment of mystical themes. Despite the significance of the above figures, none of them reached the eminence of the greatest master of Gnostic and philosophical Sufism, Sheikh Mu'in al-Din ibn Arabah, 1165 to 1240s, often referred to Sheikh al-Akbar, the great master. Ibn Arabah, whose encyclopedic works, The Bezels of Wisdom, Funi al-Akam, and Meccan Victories, Futuhat al-Makkiyah, provide us with one of the most complex mystical paradigms in the Islamic mystical genre. Often referred to as the doctrine of the unity of being, Wadat al-Wijad, Ibn Arabah's philosophical mysticism offers a vast synthesis of Gnostic and Sufi ideas, as well as a type of philosophical discourse, which, for the first time, formulates the Sufi doctrine. With Ibn Arabah, we see a monumental effort to comment on a full array of metaphysical, cosmological, and psychological aspects of Gnosticism, thereby providing a vision of reality whose attainment requires the practice of the Sufi path. Ibn Arabah's philosophico-mystical edifice is a process of spiritual hermeneutics, tawa, which relies on the language of symbolism to guide a novice from the exterior, orier, to the interior, being. For Ibn Arabah, the entire cosmos represents signs, ayat, which lend themselves to symbolic exegesis, a process whose pinnacle is the universal man, al-insan al-kamal. Ibn Arabah, whose doctrine of the unity of being, Wandat al-Wijad, has been interpreted by many to be pantheism, was nevertheless careful to argue that even though God dwells in things, but the world is not in God. For Ibn Arabah, humans are microcosms, and the universe is the macrocosm. The universal man is the one who realizes all of his inherent potentialities, including the divine breath which was blown into man by God in the beginning of creation, as the Quran says. For Ibn Arabah, it is the spiritual realization of God within the soul that leads to union with God. See Nasser, 1964, Chittick, 1989 and 2007. In the 12th centuries, during the so-called period of decline of philosophical activities, the most notable figure was the philosopher-mystic Sheikh Shihab al-Din Sarawarta, the founder of the School of Illumination, Ishraq. Sarawarta, who was a peripatetic, wrote 4 major works, primarily in the Aristotelian tradition. He also wrote a number of works in a peculiar esoteric tradition, using what he called the language of illumination. Lisan al-Ishraq. In his illuminationist writings, Sarawarta relies on Neoplatonism, but replaces such concepts as being and existence with light and illumination, thus offering what can be called a Gnostic illuminationist version of Avicennian philosophy. Amin Razavi, 2003. He offers his doctrine of illumination in his major work, The Philosophy of Illumination, Hikmat al-Ishraq. In his Sufi writings, Sarawarta employs both allegory and didactic language to advise the novice how to follow the Sufi path, often with specific instructions regarding ascetic practices. Practical wisdom constitutes an inseparable component of the Ishraq doctrine, so much so that in the introduction to his magnum opus, The Philosophy of Illumination, Sarawarta warns the reader that the secrets of the book will remain hidden to the reader unless he fasts for 40 days and avoids consuming meat. Sarawarta, similar to Ibn Arabah, uses symbolism from nature and animals to offer a spiritual hermeneutic, tawa, which begins with discursive philosophy but ends in gnosis and the spiritual return of man to his original abode. Sarawarta is also credited with having advocated an epistemological theory known as knowledge by presence, ilm al-yuwara, in which knowledge is attained directly and experientially, when the knower, known, and the epistemic relation become one and the same. Yazdi, 1992. Sarawarta's works on Sufism, most of which are written in Persian, include The Red Intellect, Akla-i Sirk, The Chant of Gabriel's Wing. Was I par I Jiberwa. Story of the Occidental Exile. Kinate al-Gurbat al-Garbia, Language of the Termites. Lugt I Muron. Treatise on the State of Childhood. Rizola Finod al-Afilaya, A Day Among the Sufis. Ruzenbo Jamiat I Ufine. The Sound of the Griffin, Safar I Simurg. Treatise of the Nocturnal Ascent, Rizola Fil Mirn, and Treatise of Illumination, Partonama, Amin Razavi, 1994. Sarawarda's illuminationist philosophy has influenced many philosophers who wrote major commentaries on Gnostic and Sufi texts, among whom are Qutb Don Shiraza, 1236–1311s, Muhammad Sharazura, d. 1153s, and Ibn Turka in Fanana, c. 1362–1433s. Following Sarawarda, there is an even closer nexus between philosophy and mysticism. A number of rationalistic philosophers who adhered to Sufi ideas and often practiced Sufism became exponents of philosophical mysticism. The post-Sarawardian philosopher-mystics, who continued to refine the rapprochement between philosophy and mysticism, have come to be known as the School of Shirns. Among other philosophers of this period, not necessarily affiliated with the School of Shirns, but interested in Sufism, are Nauner al-Donosan, 1201–1274, who wrote a work on Sufi ethics entitled Description of Nobles, Awuf al-Ashraf, as well as Afdal al-Don Kushna, d. 1213, a Sufi poet and philosopher. The latter was a strict Aristotelian who wrote extensive commentary on logic and other aspects of Aristotelian thought. While the majority of his 52 works are philosophical in nature, Kushna sees the task of philosophy to be the facilitation of following the path of God, as the title of one of his works suggests. His commentary on Ibn Arabi, his references to other Gnostics and Sufis, and his mystical poetry have identified him more as a Sufi than a rationalistic philosopher. Writing quatrains in the style of Omar Khayyam, 1048–1131, it is in his poetry that Sufism is most apparent. In a quatrain he says, O pure Sufi seeking God, he has no place, from where do you seek him? If you do know him, why do you seek him? If you don't know him, whom are you seeking? Chittick, 2001. Moving from Persia to India in the 11th centuries. When the Persian dynasty of Ghaznavids began to rule in India, philosophical mysticism and the practice of Sufism became popular among the Indian Muslim philosophers. Among the central figures of this movement are Sheikh Yusuf Gardia Multona, Sheikh Ismail Lahora, Imam Ozan Sanina, and Sheikh Abul Ozan al-Hujwara, the philosopher Sufi and the author of Unveiling of the Veiled, Kashf al-Majab. At that time, the Ismaili missionaries, who had spread the Gnostic interpretation of Islam in India, had already created a receptive intellectual milieu for the Sufi and Gnostic ideas. By the 14th centuries, due to the migration of Persian philosophers and their students to northern India, the more mystically oriented philosophy of the above figures gained popularity in India as well. Within the next 2 centuries, despite the rise and fall of several dynasties, the patronage of philosophers in India in general did not change. Sufi patronage reached a new high during the Mongol period, whose rulers were particularly keen in the Sufi tradition in all its manifestations, especially philosophy, poetry, and the visual arts. Such notable Persian philosophers as Taftazona, c. 1322–1390s, and Jurjona, 1097–1127s, went to India at this time. They were followed by such figures as Marfadan al-Shiraza, who reformed the educational curriculums to emphasize the teachings of the mystical philosophies of his Persian teachers. Philosophical mysticism continued in the Islamic philosophical tradition of northern India in figures such as Chauta Muhammad Bakmiela, b. 1563, a celebrated mystic and the founder of Naqshbandi Sufi order, as well as in his student, Sheikh Ahmad Sarindo, 1564–1624, the proponent of the doctrine of the unity of consciousness, Wandad al-Shud, and the author of epistles, Maktubat. Other Muslim philosophers from the Indo-Pakistani continent who incorporated mysticism were Mullah Abd al-Akam Sayyid Kota, Mullah Maim Junpura Faruqa, and Morsi Muhammad Zahid Harawa, 1603–1652, who became the proponent of Sarawarda's illuminationist philosophy, and perhaps the most well-known philosopher-mystic Shawwal Ullah, who lived in the 18th centuries. Wliula made an attempt to reconcile Ibn Arabi's doctrine of the unity of being, Wandat al-Wijad, and Surinda's doctrine of the unity of consciousness, Wandat al-Shud. In addition to his numerous writings on the foundation of Sufi metaphysics, Wliula should be given credit for bringing legitimacy to mystical doctrine, despite the attacks of orthodox jurists who saw Sufism as heretical. Mysticism in Arabic and Islamic Philosophy. Brought to you by Audio.ai. By Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. 4. The School of Isfahan and Mulla Sadra. Back in Persia came the advent of the Safavid dynasty in the 16th centuries, the founders of which were practicing Sufis affiliated with the Grand Sufi master, Alfa al-Din Ardabila, 1252–1334. There the use of Sufi doctrine, philosophy, and asceticism within a single philosophical paradigm reached its pinnacle. The most important issue of what came to be called the School of Isfahan was the reality of being, Haqiqat al-Wijad, as opposed to the concept of being, Mafhum al-Wijad. The founder of the School of Isfahan, Mar Damad, d. 1631 or 1632, was a follower of Sarawardi's philosophy of illumination, even choosing the pen name Ishraq, illumination. He not only wrote extensively on the metaphysical foundation of mysticism in his major work Sparks of Fire, Al-Kabasat, and in his ecstasies, Al-Jadwat, heavenly mystical states, Khalsat al-Malakat, and his disassociations, Al-Klayat, he also wrote mystical poetry. Even though Mar Damad wrote extensively on peripatetic philosophy, and especially the concept of time, he is to be credited with a Gnostic interpretation of Avicennan philosophy. His philosophico-mystical structure, based on the principality of essence, provides the intellectual framework for the ascendance of the soul and its eventual unity with its source. It was, however, his student Adr al-Din Shirazi, known as Mulla Adra, who is perhaps the greatest metaphysician of the Islamic philosophical tradition. His grand synthesis of discursive philosophy, intellectual intuition, and asceticism came to be known as the Transcendental Theosophy, al-Hikmat al-Mutahilya. This philosophical perspective, according to Mulla Adra, was unveiled to him by God after many years of inner purification. With Mulla Adra, an attempt to offer a spiritual commentary, Tawal, from a Shiite Gnostic perspective on the Quran, and the concept of spiritual guardianship, Wiloya, reaches its pinnacle. His magnum opus, The Four Journeys of the Intellect, Al-Asfar al-Arbahat al-Aqliya, is a philosophical and Gnostic exposition of the highest caliber, in which the descending and ascending journey of the soul from and to God is treated in detail. This work, which is an encyclopedia of gnosis, philosophy, and mysticism, incorporates much of what Ibn Arabi and other philosopher-mystics had brought forth to date. For Mulla Adra, creation represents four journeys. The fall, in which unity becomes multiplicity, is the first, followed by one's earthly journey, wherein the pain of separation causes an existential yearning towards one's original abode. According to Mulla Adra, man's spiritual ascendance through the path of Sufism and Gnosticism constitutes the third part of this journey until unity once again is accomplished. Finally, there is the sojourn in the divine realm, from truth, oak, to truth, a station only few of the spiritual elites may ever experience. Mulla Adra can be regarded as the reviver of the authentic mystical wisdom to be attained through mysticism, and the intellectual intuition not divorced from rationality. Mulla Adra makes extensive use of logical analyses and demonstrative proofs, which rest on what he calls illuminative principle, Qaidah Ithriqiyah, that is, what has entered the heart, al-Varadat al-Kalbaya, or divinely realized knowledge, Taqiq Arsha. Some works that are indicative of his commitment to philosophical mysticism are Metaphysical Penetrations, al-Mashari, Wisdom of the Throne, Hikmat al-Arshaya, The Unity of the Knower and the Known, Iti and Aql wal Maqal, and Secrets of the Quranic Verses, Asr al-Ayat, a Gnostic commentary on the famous light verses. The above works, all of which are continuations of Adrian philosophy, further elaborate the fine points of transcendentalist theosophy, which was firmly based on the principality of existence over essence, gradation, and the oneness that appears as multiplicity. The question is how to transcend the world of objects which appears as many, to see the oneness which lies at the heart of multiplicity. The post-Sorowardian and Sadrian answer is that a combination of practical wisdom and intellectual intuition, which transcends discursive reasoning, provides one with the vision to see the oneness lying at the heart of multiplicity. Mysticism in Arabic and Islamic Philosophy. Brought to you by Audio.ai. By Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. 5. The Case of Rama. Muhammad Jalal al-Din Balkan, better known as Rama, is regarded by many to be one of the greatest Sufi poets of the Islamic tradition. In his magnum opus, Mathnawa, which has been called by some the Persian Quran, Rama scorns discursive thought and ridicules philosophers for walking on wobbly stilts. Rationalists' legs are just like stilts. How unfixed and stolid are feet of wood. Nicholson, I. 2127. Nevertheless, he became an influential figure in the tradition of post-Avicennian philosophical Sufism. Rama's critique of peripatetic philosophy is closer to Ghazali's critique of rationalism than an outright rejection of it. Advocating epistemological humility, Rama offers a critique of such traditional epistemological theories as truth by correspondence, authority, and reasoning, while allowing for a more experiential aspect of truth. In his Mathnawa, Rama criticizes the reliability of truth claims based on sensory perception as well. All the senses of man are impermanent, for in the presence of the light of the day of resurrection they're naught. The light of the senses and spirits of our fathers is not totally evanescent and not like plants. Nicholson 431-33. While the senses provide us with some knowledge, it is not a type of knowledge that can lead to the discovery of spiritual and existential truth. Rama also rejects the idea of truth by authority and alludes to the dangers of blindly following those who claim to know the truth. His critique is particularly aimed at Muslim jurists who adhere to the divine command theory. A myriad servile conformists who follow conjecture are cast down into the lowest depths, struck by scruples. For the speculative following of precedent and logical supposition is their foundation and the very feather and wing of their flight. Their inner devil arouses doubts and specious arguments in them, till benightedly they plummet headlong down like blind folk. Nicholson 4:21-25-27. As to the application of reason which is at the heart of philosophical enterprise, Rama divides the intellect into universal intellect, akala kulla, and particular intellect, akala juz'a. Whereas the universal intellect attends to the affairs of the divine realm, the particular intellect scope is restricted to this world. In response to the Muslim rationalists, Mutazilites, Rama states, the difference among intellects was intrinsic in origin. You should hear the doctrine according to the traditionalists, contrary to the opinion of the Mutazilites, who maintain all intellects in their origin were basically equal. But by experience and learning, minds increase or decrease. So one is made more knowledgeable than the other one. Their doctrine is false because even a boy's counsel, who has no experience in any course of action, from that young child a thought will spring up, which a wise old sage with manifold experience has no inkling. Nicholson 3:1539-43. And again Rama asserts, the animal man who by deceit and cunning knows the intricacies of the science of geometry, or astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, which are concerned with this world, is barred from finding the way to seventh heaven. All those sciences are fit for building a stable. They serve as columns for the abode of camels and cows. Their purpose is but to let the animal survive a day or two, And yet these imbeciles call those sciences mysteries. Nicholson 4, 1519 to 1516. Having criticized theories of truth by correspondence, authority, and reasoning, Rama advocates a more existential understanding of truth, which he, along with many Islamic philosophers, refer to as the universal intellect. He tells us, the other intellect is a gift from God, whose source is like a spring within the soul. When the water of knowledge gushes forth from the heart, it neither becomes fetid, grows old, nor wilts. If its path where it flows is blocked, why worry? For like a spring it gushes forth from the house constantly. The acquired intellect is like a water sluice, running down into houses from the hills. If the path of water is obstructed, it's undone. Seek the spring from within yourself. Nicholson 4, 1964-68. Philosophers' reliance on reason alone clashes with the validity of knowledge by intuition and divine revelation according to Rama. The philosopher through thought and surmise is in denial. Tell him go and smash his head against this wall. The language of water, of earth and mire, is comprehensible to the senses of the heart's adepts. The philosopher who is skeptical about the moaning pillar one is himself estranged from the senses of the sages. Such things are, he says, but a reflection of melancholic passions, which generate these wild fantasies in people's heads. Nicholson I, 3278-81. Where Rama and some philosophers agree upon is the existence of the very faculty of intuition, which is often associated with the universal intellect. According to Rama, this faculty, which must be awakened by practicing the arduous process of the mystical path, leads to the awakening of the 5 internal spiritual senses that complement the 5 external physical senses. All the 10 senses are controlled by the symbolic heart, the organ of supersensory perception. There are 5 spiritual senses besides these 5 physical senses. The former are like red gold, and the latter like copper. In the marketplace where the expert connoisseurs are busy, how should the copper and golden senses be priced the same? The physical sense's nutriment is murky and tenebrous. The spiritual sense sups and dines on the sun. Nicholson 2, 49-51. Be silent, drink silently. Veil yourself, for you are the hidden treasure. Speak not of this exposition of my heart. So you be not bewildered, so you do not remain perplexed. Khalid-i Shams, Volume 2, Ghazal 637, VV. 6649, 6653. Rama's impact on Islamic philosophy can be seen in various commentaries on philosophical Gnosticism that were influenced by Rama's works. The tradition of writing commentaries or quoting Rama, which appears in the works of Mullah Adra, Lohija, and Sabzawara, continues well into the modern era. Mysticism in Arabic and Islamic Philosophy. Brought to you by Audio.ai. By Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. 6. Conclusion. Even though post-Sadrian philosophy in the Islamic tradition never reached the level of accomplishment of the great masters of the Safavid period, Sadra's school of metaphysics found followers in the periods that were to follow, both in and outside of Persia. While Mullah Idris' influence was marginal in the Arab world, which has generally seemed to distance itself from traditional metaphysical issues, in India, Adrian philosophy was well received, and it is taught in traditional schools today. The number of Muslim philosophers who became proponents of mystical philosophy in the Islamic world are too numerous to mention here. But clearly mysticism is a living tradition that continues to occupy center stage in the philosophy in the Muslim world. It is virtually impossible to fully account for all the traditions of mysticism in the Islamic philosophical tradition. However, such traditions do exist in almost every Muslim country today. See Killia 1996. The impact of mysticism on Islamic philosophy has been so profound that it has changed the very essence and definition of philosophizing. The enterprise of philosophizing in the Islamic tradition is seen by most not merely as an intellectual exercise, but as the intellectual dimension of the soul's spiritual journey towards the unveiling of truth. Authentic philosophy, according to Muslim philosopher mystics, is therefore committed to providing a rationalistic commentary upon those issues which traditionally belong to the mystical domain only.